We open tonight with what will probably be the most unsurprising bit of news you've heard so far this year. Dr. Anthony Fauci, in the spring of 2020, got together with his good friend Dr. Francis Collins, and the two of them commissioned a study that was expressly designed to downplay the likelihood that the great communist Chinese Wuhan Kung Flu coronavirus of 2019 originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then, because he's a man who was literally born without the capacity for shame, Tony Fauci ran around to every TV camera in town, as is his habit, waving that study around, not mentioning that it was a study he personally cooked up to cover his own ass, just saying, look, the experts say I'm right. Follow the science. Don't forget your bumper stickers and prayer candles at FauciShop.com. But since we haven't had a Tony Fauci update since the new year, and what a joy that was, I think it's only a fitting time to take a peek at the Tony Fauci scoreboard. Actually, no, belay that order. I'm going to state my thesis in a different way this time. Do you remember Anthony Scaramucci? The Mooch to his friends? That ridiculous, greasy buffoon who Trump for some reason hired to be the White House comms director and then flamed out in, what was it, about 8 days? Probably the most disastrous hire of Trump's presidency, who isn't named Christopher Wray. And that's exactly why I have chosen him for this allegory. Anyway, picture that guy in all of his bumbling glory as I submit for your consideration the following. If, on the first day of his administration, Donald Trump had fired Anthony Fauci as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and replaced him with the Mooch, who was a non-doctor and a total dumbass, there would have been no COVID pandemic. And I'll tell you why I think that. Because would it have ever occurred to the Mooch to help communist China build a potential bioweapon lab by giving them a special dispensation under the auspices of the World Health Organization to construct a biosecurity level 4 facility? Would it ever have occurred to the Mooch to secretly funnel U.S. taxpayer money to communist China through a third-party front company to help them conduct potentially very highly dangerous gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses? The kind of research that could potentially kill millions the world over if something should happen to go wrong? Anthony Scaramucci may not have a lab coat and a stethoscope and a fancy medical degree hanging on the wall, but I don't think he would ever be stupid or evil or hubristic enough to do either of those things. But Tony Fauci, the expert we're supposed to trust, the eminently well-qualified professional man of science, he was stupid and evil and hubristic enough to do those things. And when he got caught, what did he do? Well, he cooked the books and covered his ass and tried to gaslight the entire world, just like criminals have been doing since time immemorial. So the bottom line of the thesis is this. You know what? I'll go even farther than Anthony Scaramucci. If Trump had given Tony Fauci's job to some random homeless man from the streets of D.C., that guy would have done a better job and killed a hell of a lot fewer innocent people than Tony Fauci did. Jim Eagle, hit the music, please. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where seeing your enemy driven before you and hearing the lamentations of your women isn't just a way of life, it's a job. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And I made a fairly serious mistake last night, I'm afraid. I decided to watch All the President's Men. And oh boy did it piss me off. I don't think I've seen the picture since high school, and if you're in the same age group I am, you probably saw it in high school too, because when it was time to learn about that period in history, about Nixon and Watergate and what have you, the teacher turned on that movie, and everybody watched it, and that was it. There you go. There's your history lesson. That is exactly what happened. And what an incredible load of bullshit that is. But it's a load of bullshit that nearly everybody, left and right alike, even lots of people who should know better, actually believe, because 50 years of relentless revision history, whitewashed gaslighting is one hell of a drug after all. Now, we've talked a few times before, probably maybe more than a few times, about how disconnected the official narrative of the Watergate scandal, the one that's been carefully implanted in the public consciousness, does not represent an honest reading of history. And All the President's Men, first the book, then the movie, both of which were rushed out just as quickly as possible and promoted relentlessly, was the single biggest instrument in that implantation. In fact, it might surprise you to learn that All the President's Men, the book, actually came out before the end of the scandal on 15 June 1974, 1 week before the birth of your host and 7 weeks before Nixon's resignation. And if you're saying, wait, hold on a minute, does that mean the release of the book was timed so as to help actually force his resignation? Well, now you're starting to catch on, little grasshopper. And tell me this, how many examples can you think of where a book was published and then adapted into a major big-budget Hollywood motion picture within less than 2 years from the publication of the book to the premiere of the movie? Yeah, me either. But for my entire life, it's been considered something close to heresy to question the official establishment narrative of the Watergate scandal as presented in the book and then in the movie. For people in the Washington liberal establishment, that book and movie are just about the closest thing they have to religious scriptures. And the narrative, it goes something like this. Nixon was a crook and a maniac and the biggest arch villain in the history of American politics, and the Washington Post was an upstanding institution engaged in a relentless pursuit of truth and justice, and Woodward and Bernstein were a couple of young, intrepid, idealistic reporters writing a new chapter in the annals of investigative journalism. They broke the story and blew the scandal open and brought down the most powerful man in the world through the magic power of journalisming. And isn't that just a lovely story for a screenplay? Yeah, but is it history? Well, as history, it's 100% grade A horse shit. Now, you don't need me to tell you that here today in the year 2023, the Washington Post is the official in-house newsletter of the Washington liberal establishment. I think most people who don't know better assume this is some sort of fairly recent development. Some probably think it even began with Donald Trump, but it ain't, and it didn't. Not by a long shot. Now, in the standard establishment-approved Watergate narrative, Nixon is an out-of-control paranoiac who thinks the press and the deep state are all out to get him, but he's just dreaming the whole thing up in his own fevered imagination. But if we take a moment to glance at the actual historical record, we will find that the Washington Post had been trying to destroy Richard Nixon since all the way back in 1952 when he was Eisenhower's running mate. Do you remember the Checkers speech? Everybody remembers part of that speech, the little snippet where he says, "Oh, my daughter's like that puppy and we're not giving him back." But do you remember why he had to give that speech in the first place? It was because the goddamn Washington Post was trying to stitch him up for taking improper campaign contributions. They wanted to destroy this guy even when he was just a congressman running for vice president. And why was that? Well, because he was seen as being too idealistic and too staunchly anti-communist. The Washington establishment doesn't like it when you are too anti-communist, then just as now. Nixon, when he was a congressman, he was viewed by the press and the deep state in much the same way that a guy like Matt Gaetz is viewed now, whom they are also trying to destroy with trumped-up allegations. Probably not a coincidence. If there is anything official Washington hates, it's a young conservative in Congress who wants to do right by the people in his district, who resists being co-opted into the Washington Old Boys Club, and seeks to expose the rampant corruption and malfeasance that routinely goes on in our nation's capital. But Nixon was a more sophisticated operator than the people who tried to destroy him in 1952 ever realized. When he found himself the subject of these clearly false allegations that were designed to ruin his reputation and to get Eisenhower to throw him off the ticket, he responded to it in a way that was unprecedented up to that time in American politics. He asks the networks for a slot in primetime so he can personally address the charges. This was the first major political speech that was ever done expressly for television audiences, and Nixon absolutely crushed the people who thought they were going to be able to crush him so easily. He goes on television, gives an entire rundown of all his family's assets and finances, and then he finishes by saying, "Oh, there is one in-kind gift we received, and it was a little cocker spaniel that my daughter Tricia named Checkers, and we're not giving him back." It was political theater of the most masterful kind. Nixon took a thing that was intended to destroy him and he turned it into a triumph. But if there's anything we know about the deep state and the fake news media, it's that they do not like being embarrassed. Nor do they ever forgive, and they have a hell of a long memory. In this particular case, 22 years long. That's how long it took them to avenge the Checkers speech. And once they had completed their task in August of 1974, then came the new task of making sure our version of things, where we are the noble, virtuous heroes and Nixon is the bad, evil villain, that's the only version that ever gets implanted in the public consciousness and the historical record. And on that score, there is no arguing that they succeeded probably beyond their own wildest dreams. No 50-year-old event has ever been whitewashed as effectively as Watergate has. All the President's Men, the movie, it comes out in April of '76, barely a year and a half after the resignation. And in addition to being a nakedly transparent attempt at writing a self-serving historical record, it also marks the beginning of the open and very public alliance between Hollywood and the news media and the Washington political establishment. The alliance that we think of today as just a fact of life. But it had a beginning, and that was it. Ben Bradley, the publisher of the Post, he had spent the last 20-plus years trying to ruin Dick Nixon. He was a full-on Democrat Party operator, and not exactly the most savory character who ever lived either. But we can fix that. We'll just cast Jason Robards to play him in the movie. Who the hell doesn't trust Jason Robards? And get me Jack Warden to play the Metro editor. Everybody trusts that guy, too. And we'll have Woodward and Bernstein be played by the two hunkiest leading men in mid-1970s Hollywood. It'll be great. We got all the bases covered here. And when you watch this picture after not having seen it for many years, there are certain things that jump out at you. Especially when you realize that nothing we saw with Donald Trump was new under the sun. The news media and the administrative state have been trying to destroy presidents they don't like for many, many, many years now. Nothing about this began with Donald Trump. Trump is just the latest chapter in a tale as old as time. Oh, and you know what else we could do with the casting? Let's have Hal Holbrook play Deep Throat. We're going to have the three most trustworthy actors in America all on the same team. Nobody's going to question a damn thing. And it really does change one's perspective watching this picture for the first time with the knowledge that Deep Throat was in fact Mark Felt, deputy director of the FBI, the same job our friend Andy McCabe used to occupy, incidentally. And how about let's dispense for the final time with this fantasy that Bob Woodward broke this story by being such a great and committed journalismer? Because that is not what happened. The story fell into Woodward's lap because he was the guy Mark Felt decided to start leaking stuff to. And why was he chosen? Because he happened to live in the same apartment complex. And that's it. And then there's the burglary itself. One thing that really jumped out at me in watching the movie is that no mention is ever made, not one single word, about what it was the burglars were attempting to do when they broke into DNC headquarters and got themselves caught. They just show us some scary-looking guys in black hats and trench coats, and presumably we, the audience, are supposed to assume that they are some very sophisticated criminal operators doing some very sophisticated criminal shit. But in reality, they were a bunch of complete idiots with delusions of grandeur who were playing secret agent man on the weekend. One guy among them had briefly been a very low-level intelligence asset for the CIA, and he was the kind of guy who, if you met him in a bar, the first thing he would volunteer about himself within like 90 seconds is that he used to work for the CIA. One of those guys. But you can't present these guys as what they really were, because then your movie turns from a spy thriller into the farcical comedy of errors that the thing actually was. Again, how sophisticated of a spy are you really when you get defeated by a minimum wage security guard and a piece of scotch tape? And if you're the screenwriters, it's just going to seem ridiculous if you take the time to explain what jackasses these guys were trying to... The idea was to surreptitiously plant listening devices throughout the DNC's offices in the hopes of discovering... who knows? The fact that these five doofuses thought Richard Nixon needed help getting reelected in 1972 tells you just all you need to know about their lack of good judgment. Nixon won 49 states and 520 electoral votes in that election, which for the record is the second most dominant ass-kicking in the history of presidential politics, trailing only Ronald Reagan's 525 electoral vote curb stomping that he dropped on Mondale in '84. But the liars who wrote the official history of Watergate, it has to be said, they have succeeded spectacularly in their goal of obfuscating the fact that Richard Nixon is, up on the scoreboard, and the scoreboard don't lie, the most popular presidential candidate in United States history in terms of votes received. He lost, allegedly, a nail-biter in 1960, then he won dominantly in 68 and won even more dominantly in 72, but we don't talk about any of that anymore because the people who appointed themselves the writers of the historical record don't want us to talk about it. They only want Richard Nixon to exist as some sort of comic book movie villain who resigned the presidency in disgrace, and that is the only relevant thing about his life. But it's a funny thing about history that it is never done being written, and a whitewashed, self-serving historical narrative can only persist so long as people in the present day allow it to persist. Does it make sense, knowing everything we know, that one book written by the Washington Post and one movie executive produced by the Washington Post represent the actual, true, and correct historical narrative and record of Nixon and Watergate? That it's all as simple as a corrupt crook of a president being brought down by the plucky determination of a couple anonymous Metro desk newspaper reporters? It's a hell of a great story as a piece of narrative entertainment, but history it is not. Nixon thought people were out to get him because they damn well were out to get him. He thought the press treated him unfairly because they damn well did treat him unfairly. And ultimately, he brought himself down when he decided to get down in the muck with the fake news sludge-mongers and play their game on a field of their choosing. If you watch documentaries about Watergate, you only get dutiful recitations of the approved narrative, the heroic tale of Woodward and Bernstein bringing down the bad Nixon man. Equal time means they might drag Pat Buchanan out for one little 7-second soundbite, and then that's about enough of that. But are we obliged in any way to let Hollywood and the fake news performance artists dictate to us what the historical record must look like and what it must contain? No. We are not. And we should do a better job of acting like it. History has no political agenda. It doesn't exist to bolster anybody's resume or reputation. It is not a story. It's just the events that happened. And if we owe a debt to the generations that follow us, that debt doesn't just involve being good stewards of the natural world and handing down well-ordered civic institutions. It also means being responsible stewards of the historical record, and particularly those events that transpired within our own living memory. Is All the President's Men a great movie? Sure it is. Is it a historical document? No, it absolutely is not. And we do future generations a disservice when we pretend it is. So how about let's stop doing that? Thanks very much indeed for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. See you Thursday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.